A universe beloved for its clear, nostalgic storytelling ends not with a definitive exclamation point, but with a question mark so immense it spawned weeks of furious fan theories, leaked B-roll analysis, and full-blown conspiracy theories about a secret canon ending.
That universe is, of course, Stranger Things, wrapping up its run in a way that, while it certainly generated a monumental amount of discussion, it also left a huge portion of its audience feeling just utterly betrayed by what a lot of critics were calling lazy writing.
Yeah, or even a profound misunderstanding of the characters they'd followed for almost a decade.
Exactly.
So today we are doing a meticulous deep dive into the sources you provided, which really forensically dissects the chaos around the season 5 finale. Our mission is clear. We need to unpack what the creators said they intended, analyze that feverish fan pushback, and really examine the evidence for this theory of an unreleased canonical conclusion.
Right. We're here to understand the anatomy of this finale backlash. I mean, why did a story that was designed from the ground up to evoke this clear, heartfelt 80s sentiment choose to end in such intentional and frankly frustrating ambiguity?
It's an absolutely essential case study, I think, in the modern relationship between creators and a highly invested fandom.
Oh, completely. When disappointment hits this hard, it doesn't just lead to complaints. It triggers these detailed, crowdsourced, almost quasi-forensic investigations into everything from Netflix's back-end cataloging system to, divorce records.
Wow.
We're breaking down the moment where artistic intent collided pretty violently with audience expectation.
Okay, let's unpack this immediately, starting with the character who sits right at the heart of the show and whose fate was left most dramatically ambiguous, Eleven.
This section's really about understanding the narrative tightrope the creators were trying to walk. They had a specific emotional goal for Eleven's conclusion, and that required them to prioritize a feeling over the actual facts.
They aimed for what they described in interviews as hopeful ambiguity. And this wasn't just some vague wish. They had a clear artistic blueprint, specifically citing the conclusion of a classic, emotionally resonant film, Steven Spielberg's E.T.
And we know exactly why that reference matters.
Yeah.
The end of E.T. is, it's a painful separation, but it's one laced with the implied promise of connection.
Right.
The goal for the audience is to be hopeful that Eleven and Mike, who represent that core emotional relationship, will eventually reunite someday, but without giving us a definitive timeline or, a method for how that would happen.
They wanted to capture the lingering potential of childhood friendships, not the mundane logistics of adult life. It's almost an attempt to manufacture nostalgia for a future that hasn't happened yet.
It is, but here's the high stakes risk involved. The creators were so committed to this ambiguity that they deliberately avoided confirming Eleven's 100% survival immediately after the finale aired.
That decision was articulated very clearly, right? They felt that confirming her safety would have trampled on their intended tone.
Yeah, that's the word they used, trampled. They wanted that specific, tearful moment of uncertainty, the audience walking away asking, did she truly make it? That moment of doubt was, for them, the purest emotional punch.
But wait. If they're invoking the E.T. ending, isn't that a bit of a convenient excuse for not finishing their own story?
How so?
Well, E.T.'s ending is ambiguous about the reunion, but it's crystal clear about E.T.'s immediate survival and departure. Here, they're kind of conflating the hope of reunion with the basic question of survival, which feels like dodging accountability for the narrative stakes they spent years building up.
That's a fantastic point, and that is precisely where the critique hits hardest. But the creators, they seem to be operating under the assumption that the audience would fill in the blank with hope, not with fear.
And we learned from the sources that the Duffer Brothers and Millie Bobby Brown were seen in interviews giving these, what were they called? Secret smiles.
Secret smiles, yeah, and laughing when the topic came up. The implication of a shared secret suggests they knew precisely what happened, that there is a true secret canon ending they're currently withholding.
So it reinforces the idea that the ambiguity was a choice, a calculated emotional lever, rather than just, a narrative accident.
Right. They seemed convinced that withholding the confirmation would maximize the immediate emotional impact, trusting the audience to wait patiently for the reveal, which, as we're about to see, turned out to be an immense miscalculation.
Because when you ask a highly engaged fandom to trust the gut feeling, they often start looking for hard evidence that validates that trust.
And they found some. The belief in Eleven's survival didn't just linger in that emotional space. It started to coalesce around specific clues embedded both within the show's imagery and through external leaks.
Okay, so let's talk about the in-show evidence first. It all centers around Mike Wheeler.
It does. In the epilogue scene, an analysis of Mike's bedroom reveals a really subtle but crucial detail. He has the same picture of 11 positioned right next to his bed that was previously on his desk next to his typewriter.
That detail seems almost throwaway, but in the tight focus of a finale epilogue, it carries immense symbolic weight. I mean, if Mike believed 11 were truly gone, like a sacrifice never coming back, that photo would probably be framed, stored away, or treated like a painful memorial.
Exactly. The casual, prominent placement next to his sleeping space suggests his belief in her survival is foundational, not just desperate coping. It signals that 11 is still an active, present part of his perceived future.
And that ties directly into his verbalized theory during the final Dungeons & Dragons game.
Mike suggests that 11 escaped and is hiding somewhere else, and he gives this kind of fanciful example of her running off to Iceland with 3 waterfalls.
Wow.
Our material strongly indicates that this theory, while it's couched in D&D terms, is intended to be accurate in its big details, meaning her actual survival is canon. His faith is the narrative device used to communicate the true outcome to the audience without explicitly showing it.
But the ambiguity was truly broken by external factors, wasn't it? Specifically, the leaked footage.
Right. New behind-the-scenes B-roll footage began circulating almost immediately after the finale, and this footage showed 11 physically jumping out of the back of the truck and running toward a specific location, a store.
This is where the forensic analysis really kicks in. The footage is raw B-roll, but the context is undeniable. Mike's D&D game specifically mentions her escape, placing it geographically away from Hawkins.
And the leaked footage likely corresponds to the production of that exact epilogue scene. It provides a visual, material form to the hopeful outcome the Duffers were trying to leave unsaid. It confirms she is alive, free, and moving toward a point of safety.
And what's crucial for the audience to note is the reported lack of suppression. Netflix has reportedly not taken this footage down.
Which is huge. In the era of immediate copyright claims and digital deletion, their decision to leave this evidence circulating strongly suggests they are content with that particular piece of the canonical puzzle being publicly known post-finale. It serves as a soft confirmation of the intended outcome without them having to officially trample their initial artistic choice.
Okay, so despite the clues pointing towards survival, a massive wave of criticism emerged when the Duffers tried to rationalize the reason for 11's ambiguous exit. And this is where the character critique gets really intense.
Yes. They introduced a metaphor that, for many critics, actively undermined the character's entire journey. They stated that 11 represents the magic of childhood and that this magic must inherently disappear or fade for the main male characters, Mike, Will, Dustin, Lucas, to achieve true maturity and growth.
And critics argued vehemently that this metaphor is fundamentally broken. It moves beyond just a simple thematic failure into territory that felt dehumanizing.
The core of the critique is that 11 is not an abstract concept. She is a deeply traumatized survivor who has spent her entire life being exploited. Reducing her to the magic that must vanish for the boys' benefit felt like the final, unintended act of objectification.
Let's consider her history. She was raised in a sterile environment, called a number, experimented on, and treated purely as a means to an end by Brenner and the Hawkins lab.
She was a weapon, not a person, for years. So for the creators to then pivot in the finale and frame her symbolically as a disposable element necessary for the boys' growth, it echoes the very abuse she suffered. It treats her character arc as secondary to a broader and, you could argue, simplistic theme.
Yeah, the character of 11 earned a narrative conclusion that honored her agency and her struggle. And critics pointed out that meaningful growth could have been achieved in ways that still honored her as a person.
Precisely. They suggested alternatives. For instance, imagine a scenario where she willingly relinquishes her powers in the final confrontation, choosing to become the normal girl she often craved to be. That is an act of empowering choice.
Or maybe her powers evolve into something internal, sustainable, and less weaponized, allowing her to live without the target painted on her back.
Exactly. Instead, her fate was dictated by this forced narrative theme, the necessary fading of childhood wonder, rather than the complex, three-dimensional person she had become. The consensus among the most passionate critics is that prioritizing this metaphor over the character's lived experience resulted in a shallow and deeply lazy conclusion.
It sacrifices their most vulnerable hero for a cheap thematic point.
It creates a sense of narrative betrayal. The character, 11, who was the engine of the entire series, felt reduced to a plot mechanic one last time, reinforcing the idea that she was a thing to be used by the story, rather than a person allowed to evolve past her trauma.
It's a classic failure of balancing thematic ambition with character integrity. And in this case, the critics argue that the thematic ambition was both poorly executed and won, but at the expense of 11's earned conclusion.
Which leads us directly into the fan response.
Right, so if the first section established the creator's intentional ambiguity, which they hoped would breed hope, this next section dives into the fan response to that gap, an intense rejection of the finale that manifested as a full-blown conspiracy theory. Conformity gate.
Conformity gate is less about solving a mystery and more about outright rejecting the reality of the final episode. It's a psychological and sociological phenomenon born of deep dissatisfaction and a refusal to accept that the show they loved ended poorly.
The central belief held by conformity gate theorists is this definitive conviction that Netflix is secretly withholding a 9-episode season 5.
And that there is a canonical unreleased episode 9 set after the aired finale. This episode, they believe, holds the true, satisfactory, and narratively sound ending.
Implying the one we watched was either a fake out or some calculated misdirect.
To truly grasp the intensity of this belief, we have to look at where this pattern comes from in major pop culture fandoms. Your sources draw parallels to other spectacular finale backlashes. We recall the disbelief over the lost ending, the insistence on an alternate Game of Thrones Season 8 ending.
And perhaps most instructively, the indoctrination theory from the Mass Effect 3 video game.
Yes, let's elaborate on that Mass Effect 3 parallel because it's a perfect example of this fan coping. The ME3 ending presented the player with 3 confusing, color-coded choices: control, synthesis, or destroy, that seemed to contradict the entire themes and character building of the previous 3 games.
It was baffling.
So the indoctrination theory argued that the protagonist, Commander Shepard, was actually being subjected to a final desperate psychological attack by the main villain, the Reapers, who brainwashed or indoctrinated him. Therefore, the confusing ending wasn't the real ending, but a trap.
The true heroic conclusion still awaited them after this hallucination. It's the ultimate form of a coping mechanism. It becomes psychologically easier for highly invested fans to believe the creators are running an elaborate intellectual long con or a secret puzzle, rather than accepting the simple, painful truth
that the creators simply wrote a flawed ending. This refusal to accept a shallow conclusion is dubbed WMD-level copium by some commentators, a monumental, intense emotional energy invested into rewriting reality itself.
And for Stranger Things, the belief was that the aired finale was too easy and too clean, necessitating a dark twist or a true, complex resolution that only episode 9 could provide.
Right. They didn't just want a better ending. They needed a reason why the current ending was bad and it was secretly a fake, became that reason.
But what makes Conformity Gate different from simple complaining is that the fans didn't just rely on emotional dissatisfaction, they marshaled specific technical evidence.
Yeah, pulled largely from how Netflix's infrastructure appeared to handle the release of the final season. This is where we get into the nitty-gritty of content delivery. Fans who looked into the back-end coding and network traffic noted discrepancies in how the episodes were cataloged.
The sources highlighted that the Season 5 episodes were logged in Netflix's internal cataloging system in a way that was not logged in the traditional way.
For context, traditional Netflix logging uses sequential identifiers that signify completeness, S05E01, S05E02, up to S05E08, and then the season is flagged as concluded. The reported discrepancy suggested that the final numerical flag was missing or incorrectly positioned,
leading theorists to conclude that the season wasn't actually registered as complete, but rather as pending a final piece, episode 9.
This technical observation provided the conspiracy with a digital foundation, and the belief was galvanized by specific platform activities. They centered their attention on a potential secret drop date of January 7th, linked to a vague mystery post that appeared on one of Netflix's less used social media accounts.
Which, in retrospect, was probably just promotional scheduling, but was seized upon as a coded message.
Of course. And the platform itself seemed to glitch or offer these tantalizing hints, searching Netflix for highly specific conspiratorial phrases like fake ending or Stranger Things Season 5, Episode 9.
Sometimes resulted in a pop-up on the screen. This pop-up, possibly due to testing or internal routing errors, made it seem as if a secret episode was momentarily available, quickly disappearing upon refresh.
But the most compelling and most frustrating piece of evidence cited by the fans was the alert system. Days after the finale aired, numerous subscribers got an automatic alert from Netflix, the type normally sent when new episodes are officially released, for another new episode.
So since they had already finished episode 8, many were absolutely convinced this was the long-awaited push notification for the secret episode 9.
They took these platform and cataloging glitches, which were almost certainly technical errors, as definitive confirmation of a deliberate, elaborate corporate conspiracy to hide the true canon.
So the very infrastructure of the streaming service, designed for seamless content delivery, became the unwitting foundation for the conspiracy theory. That's a powerful testament to fan dedication.
However, the momentum behind the unreleased canonical episode was largely undercut by subsequent official announcements. Netflix did confirm a new episode release.
It was not the secret finale.
No. It was confirmed to be a documentary about the making of Season 5, featuring extensive unreleased footage, scenes that were cut, and behind-the-scenes moments. The documentary was scheduled to be released on January 13th.
And this is a familiar playbook. The same response releasing a documentary filled with context and raw material was used after the heavily criticized Game of Thrones Season 8 finale.
It's a standard corporate response to intense finale backlash. Offer transparency and context to soothe the rage, even if you can't change the content.
But here's the irony that continued to fuel the underlying frustration. The trailer for this documentary revealed whiteboards from the cast read through containing scenes that never made it into the actual aired episodes.
And seeing tangible proof that major planned content was scrapped just confirmed the fan suspicion that the final cut felt rushed and incomplete. Even if the documentary isn't episode 9, the existence of this cut material suggests that resolutions to plot holes or better character moments were written, only to be abandoned.
It almost makes the situation worse. You realize they filmed or planned moments that could have solved narrative issues, like Will's character arc, but they were cut, maybe due to external pressure, budget constraints, or just the sheer difficulty of wrapping up a massive franchise.
Indeed. Ultimately, the synthesis of the sources suggests the most logical explanation for all of the technical evidence. The logging, the alerts, the pop-ups is far more mundane than a conspiracy.
It's likely just a series of coincidences and mistakes that happened during the complex, multi-layered chain of custody when the final episodes were delivered to and ingested by Netflix's distribution system.
And we also have to factor in the organizational structure during production. Our deep dive material mentioned that Sean Levy, a highly experienced super producer who had been integral to the show's quality since season 1.
He was absent or heavily preoccupied during the finale production, right? He was filming Deadpool and Wolverine.
Exactly. That lack of a veteran third-party guiding hand overseeing the final cut might explain the weirdness, the inconsistencies, and the rushed feel. The problem may have been less a secret conspiracy and more a simple lack of experienced oversight and structure when trying to stick the landing on a massive, intricate series.
It seems the reality is far more frustrating than the conspiracy.
Yeah.
It wasn't a fake ending, it was just a flawed one.
Which brings us to the writing itself. If the first 2 sections dealt with intentional ambiguity and the resulting fan coping, this final, most expansive section addresses the core foundational critiques that generated the rage in the first place.
The perception that the writing itself was sloppy, inconsistent, and often insulting to the established lore and characters. This is the source of the AI slop theories.
The outrage stems from specific plot failures and character betrayals that felt utterly baffling, especially given the show's massive budget and the 3-year hiatus they took between major seasons to get this conclusion right.
The foundational problem, as articulated by literary critics and showrunners in the sources, is a distinct shift in the fundamental writing methodology for the final season. It felt overwhelmingly plot-driven.
Let's simplify that for the listener. In a plot-driven approach, the writers determined the required events first. The what? For example, Eleven must disappear, Vecna must be defeated in Dimension X, the military must vanish.
And then they force the characters to conform to that required sequence. This inevitably leads to moments of logical convenience and characters acting in ways that feel disconnected from their established history simply because the plot demands it.
The critique holds that the Duffer Brothers consistently demonstrated that they knew the what big action-packed event happens next, but they failed to grasp the why.
Why would a character believably behave that way? Why would a fantastical event occur under these specific contradictory circumstances? That disconnect is the breeding ground for inconsistencies and plot holes.
And the consequence of this shift was severe damage to the core cast. The original Season 1 crew, who were the emotional anchors of the show, saw their development destroyed. Mike Wheeler, for example. His arc was viewed as suffering the most.
He went from being the heart of the group, the empathetic leader, the keeper of the emotional connection, to what critics derisively called an edgy boy, a terrible, neglectful boyfriend to Eleven, and a detached friend, especially to Will.
And this was particularly jarring because this character assassination was never earned or addressed. For instance, critics cited moments where Mike seemed entirely preoccupied with Eleven's powers, seeing her as the solution to the Vecna problem, and dismissing Will's genuine emotional turmoil and deep connection to the threat.
It's like the dialogue became, I know you're upset, Will, but Eleven's power level is the only thing that matters right now. We have to follow the plot.
It felt like the creators either forgot or actively chose to abandon the rich emotional tapestry they had woven. His relationship with Eleven felt cold, and his central defining bond with Will was virtually abandoned.
Beyond the character flaws, the deepest source of fury was the way major high-stakes plot lines were simply brushed aside or hand-waved away with vague answers or resolutions that happened off-screen.
Let's start with the military question. This represents a massive suspension of disbelief hurdle that the show utterly failed to clear. We spent seasons watching the military, specifically the U.S. government, black ops actively hunting Eleven, running secret projects, and engaging in armed conflict.
Right. And in the finale, the core group killed soldiers and publicly exposed government secrets related to highly classified operations.
Yet, after the final battle with Vecna, the military supposedly just packed up and left Hawkins. No arrests, no interrogations, no legal consequences.
And when the creators were asked about this massive gap, their responses were seen as frustratingly evasive and non-committal, right? Sounding like a shrug, I don't know, I guess this or that, or explaining that the critical resolution had just happened off screen.
Critics rightly labeled this entire military retreat a glaring, self-admitted plot hole.
But let me play devil's advocate here, which is something the audience must consider when thinking about narrative convenience versus realism. Isn't a silent vanishing actually the most terrifyingly realistic response for a top-secret black ops division?
That's a powerful counterpoint.
I mean, why would the military risk public exposure with official arrests, official inquiries, or public trials?
That's true. For a government desperate to keep a lid on illegal activities, like the Hawkins lab experiments, abandoning the asset location and erasing all evidence of the operation is the textbook move. The problem isn't necessarily the plot outcome.
It's that the explanation was never provided within the show.
Exactly. By failing to give an internal explanation, they force the audience to assume laziness, even if the intended answer was secrecy.
It's the difference between showing the effects of the secret forces operating and merely using them as a disposable roadblock. And the world-building issues were arguably even worse.
So the upside-down abyss paradox.
Yeah.
This broke the lore. For 4 seasons, we established the nature of the upside down. It was cold, dark, perpetually snowing ash, filled with vines, populated by creatures who thrived in that specific low-temperature, dank environment.
We knew the Mind Flayer and its hive mind disliked heat and fire.
But the final destination where Vecna resided, sometimes called Dimension X or the Abyss, contradicted virtually all of this established lore. It was visually presented as a bright desert, arid, barren hellscape.
It lacked the cold, dark environment that was supposedly necessary to sustain the Mind Flayer and the entire hive mind infrastructure. It looked like an entirely different plane of existence.
The confusion was so profound that critics mocked the host's own inconsistent answers regarding whether the Abyss was a dimension or a planet, coining the hilarious and frustrating term, Plemention.
That shows a fundamental, self-admitted lack of world-building consistency from the very people who created the world.
And this cosmological shift leads directly to the most egregious visual omission: the missing monster army. The Demogorgons, the Demodogs, the Demobats, the entire infantry and established threat of the Upside Down were expected to rally for the final world-ending invasion.
But they were conspicuously absent. Where were they?
The creators offered no satisfactory explanation, which immediately launched the fan jokes that the Demogorgons unionized were simply called in sick after seeing the bad script.
And those jokes mask a real narrative failure. You cannot spend 4 seasons establishing a complex hive mind military threat only to have them simply not show up for the final war.
It made the conflict feel smaller and less earned, breaking the internal logic of the established ecosystem. If the environment changed to an arid desert, Why didn't the writers acknowledge that this shift either killed the monsters or forced them to retreat? The silence was deafening.
Let's turn the focus to the big bad himself, Vecna, because the entire successful heroic strategy in the finale hinged on an equally baffling plot convenience that required nerfing the villain's established powers.
Vecna was established as a terrifying psychic entity. We know he could read Eleven's mind, and crucially, in Season 5 itself, he was literally confirmed to be in Hopper's mind near the tank the night of the final battle, extracting crucial details.
So given this capability, the ability to access the minds of the people enacting the plan just hours before, how did he fail to anticipate the group's simple sneak attack plan to travel to the Abyss and confront him directly?
The writing essentially manufactured the villain's stupidity to allow the heroic plan to proceed uninterrupted. One source pointed out the writers claimed Vecna never could have seen a sneak attack coming, which is ludicrous when he had literal psychic access to the people executing that plan.
And finally, we must revisit Will Byers, who represents a huge emotional and narrative failure. His deep, intrinsic, personal connection to the Mind Flayer and Vecna was built up and reinforced for seasons. He was the narrative canary in the coal mine.
Yet in the final hour, Will was largely sidelined and marginalized, doing little more than trying talk no jutsu on Vecna. Critics felt this was an immense squandering of narrative potential and a sign the writers simply didn't know what to do with him anymore.
He was built up over years to be the narrative linchpin. He should have been the key weapon, using his unique psychic link to puppet the abandoned Demogorgons against Vecna's army. Or, tragically, he could have been the ultimate price, sacrificing himself to sever the connection.
Neither happened, leaving his critical arc hanging loose and feeling unfinished. That failure to utilize Will felt like the final proof that the character dynamics had been entirely subjugated to the action plot.
So this overwhelming sense of narrative failure and inconsistency led to a widespread conclusion that the Duffer Brothers were not the primary creative force behind this final season.
This is the rise of the AI slog theory, a modern critique of writing that feels artificial, repetitive, and inconsistent. The writing was so disconnected from the established lore that many fans genuinely suggested the season was written, or at least heavily influenced, by ChatGPT or other AI tools.
We have to be clear. There's no evidence to support the use of AI, but the critique itself is telling. Critics flatly stated that AI probably could have done a better job because, quote, AI would actually remember prior seasons.
And beyond the technological critiques, fans resurfaced real-world external influences, starting with the show's controversial origin. The 2018 lawsuit filed by writer Charlie Kessler was brought up again. Kessler claimed the Duffer Brothers stole the core concept, originally titled Montauk.
And the speculation here is dark but logical within the fan theory ecosystem. Perhaps the original high-quality stolen material, the material that drove the success of seasons 1 through 4, had simply run out.
And the sudden, sharp decline in writing quality in Season 5 was therefore argued to represent the Duffer Brothers' own lesser ideas, which they were forced to scramble together when the rich vein of original concepts dried up.
But the most prevalent and arguably most emotionally resonant external writing theory is what has been dubbed Divorcegate.
This theory centers on Ross Duffer's now ex-wife, Leigh Janiak, who is a successful director and writer, notably the creator of the successful character-driven Fear Street trilogy.
The theory posits that Janiak was an uncredited ghostwriter or was heavily involved in the quality control, particularly for character relationships, during seasons 1 through 4.
Since she filed for divorce in February 2024, prior to Season 5's completion and release, critics argue her absence explains the catastrophic drop in quality and the specific failures related to emotional depth.
The evidence cited by these theorists is compelling regarding character. Janiak's work on the Fear Street trilogy is celebrated for featuring a strong, nuanced, and central queer romance that was successfully resolved.
And critics argued that her influence was what ensured strong character relationships and narrative consistency in early Stranger Things. Her rumored departure, therefore, is seen as the direct explanation for the catastrophic failure to resolve LGBTQ+ storylines, specifically the long-running ambiguity and emotional tension surrounding Will and Mike.
Critics universally labeled this failure as queer baiting.
The deep dive analysis supports that this theory, while speculative, addresses a central emotional void. Without that quality check, the final season devolved into cold, plot-driven chaos.
And if all that wasn't enough to enrage the audience, the final decision to externalize crucial plot elements to a separate, non-TV medium added gasoline to the fire.
We're talking about the companion stage play, Stranger Things, The First Shadow. This play, scheduled for exclusive runs in major metropolitan areas, contains crucial background information necessary for understanding the motivations and core lore of the main antagonist, Vecna.
This isn't supplementary material, this is essential context. Specifically, the play reveals the definitive, defining reason Henry killed his mother. She told Dr. Brenner to lock him up and throw away the key. This is the final, essential piece of villain motivation.
And the controversy centers on the exclusive paywall.
Yeah.
Fans were rightfully enraged that essential plot lore necessary to fully understand the series finale, was locked behind an expensive theater ticket, only available in New York and London.
This move was universally seen as lazy writing and an overt prioritization of profit-making spin-offs over narrative integrity. Critics argue this felt like the rise of DLCs for TV shows, downloadable content where you have to pay extra for the full story.
And to make matters worse, the play itself is criticized for actively retconning established series lore. It portrays Henry attending high school with Joyce, Hopper, and Karen Wheeler,
which directly contradicts the established canon that Henry was in Brenner's lab from age 12 onward, making high school attendance impossible.
So, the essential lore is not only behind a paywall, but it actively damages the world-building trust by sacrificing previous consistency for the sake of the stage play's narrative convenience.
This confirmed the core fanfare. The finale felt rushed and incomplete because the creators were already busy with the play and spin-offs, prioritizing future commercial product over sticking the landing on their original masterwork.
The story became secondary to the franchise potential.
This has been a fascinating and at times deeply cynical deep dive. So what does this all mean for the audience moving forward?
We can confidently distill 3 main points. First, regarding Eleven's fate. The canonical intention is a hopeful survival ending, deliberately left ambiguous to mirror the emotional conclusion of E.T. The clues were there, but the lack of official confirmation generated unnecessary frustration.
Second, the conformity date theory. The secret episode 9 is almost certainly fan coping, resulting from deep dissatisfaction. It was fueled by understandable technical glitches in Netflix's delivery system and the intense anticipation for the behind-the-scenes documentary.
And third, and most critically, the biggest source of fan frustration comes not just from the narrative holes themselves, but from the profound disconnect exposed in the creators' post-finale interviews. Their non-committal answers, the sound of them saying, "I don't know," when pressed on plot holes, suggested to many a fundamental lack of knowledge or care for their own established lore.
This made the poor writing feel less like an accident and more like intentional, lazy neglect. It's that feeling of betrayal that lingers. The narrative holes were already frustrating, but hearing the creators essentially shrug about complex issues, it transformed those mistakes into perceived indifference toward the audience's investment.
And that perceived indifference brings us to the future. And this is where the commercial aspect must be fully considered. The sources confirmed that the creators are already suggesting the finale's problems, the lack of resolution, the character abandonment, could be fixed in a reunion episode in 10 or 20 years.
Citing the lucrative Harry Potter cast reunion phenomenon, they are already planning the next wave of monetization centered on fixing what they failed to deliver.
Given a widespread belief, supported by evidence like the paywalled lore and the scrapped character arcs, that the writing of Season 5 was intentionally sacrificed for the sake of setting up future spin-offs, tie-in media, and commercialized product.
We have to ask you, the listener, the consumer, the highly invested fan, if the creative team prioritized profit and franchise potential over delivering a cohesive, respectful, and narratively sound conclusion to the story you loved.
Is consuming their future projects, like the announced spin-offs, purchasing the companion media, or buying tickets to the stage play, simply reinforcing the very behavior that led to this deeply disappointing conclusion?
How does the financial success of a knowingly flawed and strategically incomplete finale change the fundamental relationship between a storyteller and their audience in the age of streaming franchises? That is the reckoning for the fan base, and the choice, ultimately, is yours.
If you enjoy this video, please like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell to the later update from my channel. Thank you for watching till the end, and see you in the next video.